All right, I'm going to go ahead and start the recording as we look at session number two's notes. Again, I want to say that probably the most important thing that we can realize in our time of study is that your independent work or your independent efforts are very important too. Not that you have to read a bunch of commentaries or watch a bunch of videos necessarily, but that you read the book of Revelation hopefully several times. And that is I want to say or kind of repeat some of the things that we've said in the past, and that is, number one, we're not looking for answers to questions. We're looking for insights to help us. So we're not really if we ask questions that really are seeking necessarily an answer, we're not that those aren't important at times, but that's not necessarily what we're trying to do here. We're more trying to seek insights that will help us. Now, we're going to use questions and answers. I don't mean, and obviously that's what this guide is all about. Folks have it here, and I hope that we will learn and realize again in this session number 2 that this is a process that we are all involved in. That's the folks from Central Union and the folks at the Senior Center and myself and us who are gathered here, as well as anybody who gets to watch or wants to watch or whatever. We are involved in this process of trying to discover maybe what the Revelation is telling God's people. The first question that I asked, and I may do a little bit of reviewing as I talk here, but one of the questions that has come up at Central Union, and that is, are we saying that everything that we have ever been taught about the Revelation and the connection with the rest of the Bible was wrong all along? Ever since, John Nelson Darby. Charles Nelson I think he was a comedian, Charles Nelson Riley. John Nelson Darby sort of formulated this system back in the 1830s and popularized it among the brethren. And then it really hit again big time in the early 20th century. And basically nearly all, and maybe that's the wrong way to say it, but that's my best guess at it. Nearly all teachings or Bible studies about Revelation are some variation of John Nelson Darby's structure with, okay, there's a tribulation, there's these different events, and that's what Revelation is telling us. And so I have asked the question because it has come up. Are we saying that everything we've ever been taught or everything we've ever learned or everything, maybe some of those things you really held dear, even though you didn't necessarily think what they were saying was all true, but you thought that some of the things that was taught or that you have believed for many years, do we have to kind of just toss all that out the window? And so I have shared a quote that says from Jesus in Matthew 13:52, Jesus says, "Therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old." I have shared that quote because I think that it is important that we certainly not dispense with anything. We'll get to that here in a minute. I have brought up Johnny's quote from session 1, which the question that we continuously ask ourselves when trying to understand Revelation is is our understanding, does it line up with the same God that Jesus revealed in the Gospels? And I think that's an important question, and I don't think that we have always asked that question in the right way. So When we're teaching here, we're talking about, well, is there going to be a rapture? Is there not going to be a rapture? All those kinds of things. One of the things we're trying to ask ourselves and encourage you to ask yourself is, well, does that understanding really parallel or really kind of relate to the Jesus or to the God that Jesus reveals in the Gospels? I put here in our study, our question guide, don't ever dispose of what you were taught by faithful people who were trying to understand God's message, because there's always truth in that. I believe God always has truth in that. That doesn't mean that we don't dispose of that and say, well, that's all just, here comes this new teaching, so we just throw that all in the trash and none of that means anything anymore. We don't do that. And that's certainly not what we're trying to do here. Even though we are hopefully going to look at the Revelation from a drastically different perspective, that doesn't mean that we're saying that you have to dispense with everything that you've ever learned about Revelation before now, or up until this time that we've been studying it or talking about it. No faithful, I don't think, I say no, but there may have been some. Well, I think that's why I threw in the word faithful. No faithful interpreter has ever denied that the Revelation sends a clear message of hope for believers and thereby repeats or reiterates the same familiar, hopeful messages that we find in many other places in Scripture for believers. We hear hopeful messages. There's no question about that. We're not trying to take away and say that Revelation is going to make us go through all the same stuff that everybody else has to go through, because you're trying to take away the hope from the book of Revelation, and I don't think that's the case at all. I think that these understandings or interpreters, or however you want to say it, that they are truly trying to point to the hope rather than to say that we need to let go of that. All right, and then so for question 2, I say the question very clearly is, so does the Bible say that there will be a rapture or not? Eveline asked that question at Central Union a couple weeks ago, and I can give you several scriptures which I have prepared here.
Are we covering chapter 2 and 3?
I'm sorry?
Are we covering chapter 2 and 3, or does it just go by sessions? Because the rapture is not spoken of it's not the rapture, but until chapter 3, that's why I asked.
Right. Well, no, we're just talking about the topic of the rapture right now, and I wanted to read several scriptures, actually. Not only, because we're not at any point trying to say that the other scriptures in the Bible don't matter. Darby put together this system that combines a bunch of scriptures from a bunch of different places. No question about that, and that is one of the criticisms. But if you look at 1 Thessalonians chapter, and this is going to be one of our rare ventures outside of the book of Revelation, but if you look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17, yes. I'll go ahead and back up to 16 through 18. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up. That's where the word rapture comes from. We'll be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so will we be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. So there we have the reference in Thessalonians, and then what Charlotte was referring to is the reference in Revelation chapter 3 that I wanted to read 3:10. Since you have kept my command to endure patiently, I will also keep you from the hour of trial that is going to come on the whole world, to test the inhabitants of the earth. So these are two of the primary. I have 22, so there's 20 other scriptures that make allusions to God's faithful being raptured, or being, and what I want to specifically say is that what John Darby mainly taught, or specifically taught, was a pre-tribulation rapture. And so that means that this account that we gather from these verses that we have just read, that this will happen before the really bad stuff comes on the earth. And certainly the wording of those two verses at least would leave the door open for that. And you can see why Darby certainly, and many others, and as Charlotte said, it's not mentioned until chapter 3. And then suddenly in chapter 4, you don't hear the word church anymore for the rest of the book of Revelation. So there is certainly some framework or some basis for this notion, or this belief of the possibility that the church will be gone, will be in heaven, will be with the Lord during the worst parts of tribulation. And so what I shared with you is just a statement here. It's a little bit long. And what I want to say is this. When it comes to the revelation, what we're not saying here that the revelation does not promise deliverance for believers, just as we read. It promises deliverance for believers. What we are simply saying is that this promised deliverance could happen to us, believers, without us needing to leave this world just yet. It only makes sense that we should share this joy of the full realization of our deliverance with others before we are finally taken home to be with the Lord. I think this because it not only is biblical, it is consistent with the God revealed by Jesus. In my opinion, so what I would say, I think that there's a rapture. I just don't think that we're all going to leave before the bad tribulation happens, because I think we're going to need to be here to share God's hope with people who are going through the tribulation. I think that is consistent with what we see in the Gospels, Johnny, and so I hold on to that. That's my belief, and I believe that. I'm not gonna cut any corners or soft pedal it, and I'll say that's the way I see it. That's the way I believe it, or however you wanna articulate that. Hey, Joe Ray, how are you? But if as I say that this is what I believe, I also want you to know, as we move on to the final question, question 3, do we have to accept what you think about pre-tribulation rapture theology? In other words, do you have to kind of think, well, probably we are going to be around for a while before we can move on? Do you have to accept what I think, or what Dr. Kester thinks, or any of these other teachers think? Do you have to accept this before we can move on? And I love this quote. It's a Kurt Vonnegut, it's an Audible book that I listened to. I tried to find the quote, I can't find it, and I don't know who he was quoting. And oddly enough, when I actually try to Google the quote, they misunderstand it. All the Google people misunderstand it because it's comical. Kurt Vonnegut was a bit of a comedian, and he's trying to be comical when he says these words, I can't think of anyone who would be willing to work for what I'm actually worth. Well, all the Google people said, well, he's saying, I'm worth more than what I'm getting paid, or something like that. He's not saying that at all. He's actually making fun of himself, saying, I'm not really worth beans, and nobody's going to work for beans. And that's what he's kind of saying. He's kind of, in a roundabout way, trying to sound like he's saying, they're not paying me what I'm worth. But what he's actually saying, he's sarcastically saying, is I'm really not really worth very much. So I wrote that quote because the answer to question number 3, very simply, is no. Period. You don't have to accept anything any of my understanding. The encouragement that we are participating in here, and I'm not saying we can't help change each other's minds at times, if we need to, or understand things a little better in a different way, maybe from a different angle at times, but we're not about, okay, well, is the rapture going to happen or is it not? I don't know. That would be I absolutely believe that what the Bible says is going to happen is going to happen. There are scriptures in Matthew about 2 people being in bed and one being taken and the other left. There are scriptures about people walking up a trail and one being taken and the other left. So for me to absolutely in any way deny that people will disappear or deny that possibility would be ridiculous. But I also think that it is important for us as believers to try to see, just as those who were expecting the Messiah couldn't really see when he actually came, that we might be able to see something different in the book of Revelation that has been there all along. Nothing nothing I'll have to convince you of or talk you into. It's going to be what you will see, because that's what the revelation is for. It is for God to reveal to his people, to God's people, this wonderful message of hope in the midst of the turmoil of this crooked and vile and evil world that needs to be judged. We don't deny the need for judgment and the certainty and necessity of God's judgment. We don't soft pedal that at all in this. But what we see in this revelation, in this prophecy, in this visionary writing, apocalypse, what we see is hope. Hope for redemption. Hope right to the bitter end for people to turn to God and to see God around them. Honestly, if people start talking about the mark of the beast and things like that, I think that it will be an invisible mark, but it will be visible in that believers will look around at all the bad things that are going on and they'll see God. They'll say, oh my goodness, by golly, God has been here all along and here he comes. And people who really deep in their heart don't believe will look around at all the bad things that are going on and will say, oh no, there's not a God and there never was a God. And that was all. And I honestly think that difference will happen. I don't know how that will happen. And but I honestly think that will happen. That people will begin to behave like beasts. You watch all these old post-apocalyptic movies where people, after a big nuclear war and how they act, and you always have these groups of really bad guys, and they just do whatever they want to. Whatever. I mean, if they can, whatever, I won't go into the details, but whatever they want to, whatever suits them, because they're acting like animals. They're acting like beasts. And what I honestly believe in my heart, And I don't think that's contradictory to what I've ever believed or what it says in the Bible, and that is that those who have held on in faith all their life, who have persevered to the end, if this is the end. And Dr. Kester says, well, yeah, the end is near. God says he is the beginning and the end, and God's always near, so sure the end is always near. And yeah, I believe that. I certainly believe that, and I just hope that...
Our end is even more near.
Yeah, sure, yeah, and that's a reality that has happened to every generation. As we get older, we're more aware of how near the end is. The psalmist told us, "O Lord, teach me to number my days, that I might gain a heart of wisdom." Because it gives, maybe we can have a little better sense, Charlotte, as we get older and say, I'm not going to be here forever, And I certainly don't want to imply that we are teaching any kind of a disruption of what you already hold dear or believe. We'll see all of these kind of details, when the answers that we need in our head to make sense of things. I figure most of them we'll be right on some of them and wrong on the others. Don't you? I mean, So, and that's not what we're about here. We're about trying to see what God might show us, each one, in our own journeys. And that's what, that's what our discussion wants to continue to be, and we will. And finally, a final note for our. I'm sorry, I didn't give Joe Ray a final note for our session this week. We were at Central Union, and one of the ladies came to me afterward and said, I tried to listen to the book of Revelation, and she said I got a little tired. She said, I tried to sit down and read the book of Revelation, and she said that made me tired too. But she said when I sat down and tried to read it out loud to myself, it helped. So I would encourage you to try that, because I tried it now too, and I like listening to it. I swear by listening to the Bible on these recordings. They're awesome. But hey, whatever works, and I think this might work. So my last encouragement to you for session number 2 is to read. I sat down and read chapters 1 through 4. I don't think it took me more than maybe 10 or 12 minutes, maybe 15, and I just read it to myself. And anyway, that's where we are this week. And we will, if you want to come and join us for our discussions, come on, and we're going to start our discussion now. God bless.